Hello, folks. Today we are moving on to our second Roman epic in this course, Lucan's Pharsalia. This epic is otherwise known by another title, De Bello Civili, which is Latin for On the Civil War. First, we'll get an overview of the text itself, then take a brief look at the poet's life, before diving into the poem's major themes and characters, and we'll finish by looking at the proem. What is the Pharsalia? Like the Aeneid, it is an epic poem written in Latin and dactylic hexameter. It is in 10 books, though Lucan died before he could finish it. It is possible that, like the Aeneid, it was planned to be 12 books long. But unlike the Aeneid, it is based on real historical events in the recent history of Rome, rather than on a mythological past. We are no longer in the world of the Trojan War, but are dealing with characters for whom we have ample historical evidence. The Pharsalia is thus what we might call an historical epic. The poet takes well-documented historical events and adds the typical conventions of epic, such as epic similes, divine intervention, and original dialogue. Why is the poem called the Pharsalia? Because it is based on the events leading up to and following the Battle of Pharsalus. This was a battle fought in the north of Greece in 48 BCE between the Roman generals Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. After his conquest of modern-day France, Julius Caesar led an armed insurrection against the Roman Senate and invaded Italy. In response, the Senate adopted Pompey as their leader. Despite commanding Roman soldiers, Caesar's legions were more loyal to Caesar than they were to Rome. They were more than willing to march against their own countrymen in order to see Caesar seize supreme power in Rome. So who was Lucan? Lucan was born in 39 CE, over a half a century after the death of Virgil. By that time, the Emperor Augustus had established an imperial dynasty that would last throughout Lucan's lifetime. Rome was no longer a free republic in Lucan's day, and the Pharsalia is a poem written about how that liberty was lost. Lucan studied rhetoric and philosophy as a teenager, and in his late teens and early 20s became a politician in Rome. He quickly became friends with the Emperor Nero, since the emperor himself was a patron of poetry and the arts, and fancied himself a poet much like Lucan. However, at some point the two had a falling out, either because the emperor was jealous of Lucan's superior artistic abilities, or because they had political differences. Eventually, Lucan was implicated in a conspiracy to try to assassinate Nero, but the conspiracy failed, and Lucan was forced to commit suicide as punishment. He was only 25 years old, and he left the Pharsalia unfinished. Many read the Pharsalia as a protest against the imperial regime, by demonizing Julius Caesar as the destroyer of Roman liberty. Nero was a descendant of Caesar and would not have received the poem favorably. Now that we have established some of the context for reading this work, it is now time to dwell on some of its major themes and innovations. One should always keep in mind that Lucan is likely directly responding to Virgil's Aeneid with several of these themes. The first theme is the horrors and criminality of civil war. While the horrors of war and its effects on society are certainly explored in previous epics like the Iliad and the Aeneid, the wars in those poems at least have some moral justification, and they also serve as venues to achieve immortal glory. Heroes cannot be heroic unless they have battles to fight. But Lucan focuses on civil war as nothing more than morally evil, and that participating in civil war is tantamount to criminal activity. There is no glory in fighting one's fellow citizens and attacking one's own country. Without the glory of conquering a foreign foe, war is nothing but senseless and immoral violence. Anyone who takes part in it is guilty of a terrible crime. All of the Romans are at fault for tearing their country apart. A second theme relates to this, which is the severing of family ties. This operates at two levels. At a lower level, Lucan often mentions how in civil war, fathers potentially fight against sons and brothers against brothers. The basic unit of civil society is the household, and civil war causes even these basic building blocks to crumble. At a higher level, this civil war is between two former family members. Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus used to be political allies, and sealed that alliance with a marriage of Caesar's daughter Julia to Pompey. Julia's premature death was one reason the two men drifted apart, and Pompey remarried into an aristocratic family. Nevertheless, Lucan often refers to Caesar as Pompey's father-in-law and Pompey Magnus as Caesar's son-in-law. This reinforces the notion that civil war is a crime of parricide and shedding of kindred blood. The next two themes have to do with the Pharsalia as a spectacle as much as a story. Lucan is writing in a time when the Roman people have become used to seeing on a regular basis spectacles of violence in the Circus Maximus and the amphitheaters. These spectacles included wild beast hunts, executions of criminals, gladiator fights, and even mock naval battles. Lucan's poem offers itself as its own spectacle of violence to entertain its audience. A related theme is that of the poet Lucan as a character in the story. As a spectator of civil war and violence, we often hear Lucan's own personal reactions to events in the story. This offers us an often biased perspective, as the poet sees Caesar as destroying Republican liberty. Moreover, Lucan does not present himself as an omniscient narrator of events. He does not always make it look like he knows what happens next. He even changes his mind as to how the whole universe works. Is the world governed by a chain of fated events or by blind chance? Do the gods exist and control human affairs or not? This brings us to the next theme, which is the fact that the gods are not personal characters in the Pharsalia. No one god ever shows up in person or has any dialogue. Their presence and activity is thus much more mysterious, to the point where the poet himself is not even sure what they are up to. What implications does the lack of divine intervention have upon an epic? The final theme is central to the epic, and that is the loss of freedom and the rise of tyranny. Lucan frequently comments on the action of how the civil war is a battle between those who want an absolute ruler and those who want to maintain a free republic. That said, Lucan also notes that regardless of who the victor would have been in the civil war, he would have taken power regardless. Let us finally take a brief look at the two main heroes of the epic, Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. To start with Caesar, we see introduced the idea of the epic anti-hero. Caesar is an ambitious, driving force of the whole work, but unlike Aeneas, his ultimate goal is the destruction of the Roman Republic and the absolute rule for himself. Caesar in the Pharsalia, as in real life, was a brilliant leader in general, and Lucan translates Caesar's brilliance in the epic as a relentless force of nature, at one point compared to the destructive force of Jupiter's lightning. Caesar dominates friend and foe alike through fear, and does whatever it takes to get what he wants, and never takes no for an answer. Caesar has no god or goddess on his side other than the force of fortune that favors him. The second major hero is Pompey Magnus, Caesar's arch-nemesis. Unlike Caesar, Pompey is older, and his achievements as a great conqueror are further in the past. Pompey is accustomed to his popularity, and often rests on his laurels as proof of his capability as a leader. Pompey is chosen to lead the forces of the Roman Senate against Caesar, but Pompey as a leader is often indecisive, sluggish, and even reluctant. Pompey is often driven by events rather than driving events, like Caesar. While he does participate in the crime of civil war, he ultimately is seen more sympathetically by Lucan as the one who fought for the cause of Roman liberty, even if his own victory may very well have destroyed it. The fact that he lost the war made him appear innocent and patriotic. To finish this introductory lecture, let us take a close look at the proem of the Pharsalia itself. Quote, "Wars worse than civil we sing, waged on Amathia's plains, justice given over to crime, a powerful people, its conquering sword hand turned to strike its own vitals, kindred front lines, and after tyranny's pact had shattered, all the stricken world's forces locked in a struggle, rivals in evil, standards charging belligerent fellow standards, dueling eagles, and javelin menacing javelin. What frenzy was this, O citizens? What unleashing of steel?" End quote. The first word of the proem is much like that of the Aeneid, wars, but notice that there is no man that follows. There is no hero like Achilles, Odysseus, or Aeneas who is the central figure in this epic, and perhaps the implication is that there are no heroes in civil war. Indeed, the subject beside the wars themselves is the Roman people, who are referred to collectively as committing suicide by, quote, striking its own vitals, end quote. There's a mutual destruction at multiple levels. The phrase kindred front lines suggests that families are divided and torn apart by civil war. But not long after we see the phrase, all the stricken world's forces locked in a struggle. Because Rome rules much of the known world, a Roman civil war becomes an actual world war, as the non-Roman subject forces are called upon to take part in the fighting. Finally, we note that there are no muses being invoked in the proem, or indeed anywhere in the epic. This suggests that there is a lack of divine intervention as well as inspiration. Lucan instead asks the citizens of Rome themselves, and not a muse, what caused these events to unfold. Lucan is viewing the actions not from an omniscient perspective, but from the sidelines as a spectator. So ends the proem in our introduction to the Pharsalia.